Welcome to this DVD where we're going to be looking at a repertoire for black after e4, which involves the classical move e5. This is a very straightforward and solid way to play and can be highly recommended to club players. The responses I will be recommending for black are by and large extremely reliable and will suit the club player for their ease of understanding and ability to just play them naturally and straightforwardly. We don't want too complicated a repertoire for black. We're aiming for straightforward play. I guess we have to consider white's second moves first. Moves like f4, moves like knight c3, moves like d4, independent moves other than knight f3. And so the first opening I'm going to consider is d4, the immediate opening of the centre game in fact, which could turn into a Danish gambit. It's an opening which went out of fashion for a long while. I mean, it was played by players such as Mises back in the 1920s, didn't really catch on, and it wasn't seen again really till the 1990s, when creative grandmasters started to experiment with queen takes d4 in this position, and it started to win some games. Needless to say, black has good responses against queen takes d4. We'll be looking at that next, but I first of all want to consider the Danish gambit. This is the type of thing mad attacking club players tend to use, particularly if they've studied books like Gambitier from Grandmaster Nigel Davis, where he recommends this way of playing. Young players might play this as well. They like to open up the game. They like to go after f7 early. They like to create complications. They like to sacrifice. Well, we are going to diffuse all that with d5. I think this is a very good move. It leads to a position where black is equal without too much trouble. It enables black to bring out the pieces quickly. It's straightforward too. This is exactly what black needs. At the grandmaster level, you might need something a bit more complicated, so you play one of the other continuations. But remember, we're concentrating on straightforward play. So in view of the attack on e4, white generally takes on d5. I mean, there aren't really many other moves. Believe it or not, Bolligan once played e5 in a rapid game against a 2100 player. Well, I think there just d takes c3. White can actually claim no compensation for the pawn in this position, as after knight takes c3, black goes d4. Meanwhile, after b takes c3, black just plays knight c6. In either case, with a nice free game and an extra pawn. This was one experiment I doubt Bolligan will be repeating, as he failed to beat this 2100 in a game from Calvi 2008. So going back to our feature game, which is Herzog versus Fleer, two very strong players from Graz 1984, white took on d5 and black recaptured with the queen, so it can't be more straightforward than that. White took on d4 and now black started to put pressure on the centre immediately with knight c6. And in fact what we're doing is transposing back into a Goring gambit declined. So actually the way we're playing this with black can be used also against the Goring gambit, which we'll be looking at a little later on this DVD. So the characteristic of black's game is that all his pieces can come out freely. Fleer played bishop to g4. White breaks the pin, and now comes bishop to b4 check, another good move. Now it's worthwhile pointing out in this position that black cannot win a pawn with bishop takes f3. This is in fact a serious error, as after bishop takes c6 check, white takes away the protection from black's queen and black loses the game. Going back to the game itself, bishop b4 check just straightforwardly develops the bishop, and Herzog plays knight to c3. Now comes Capablanca's old continuation, bishop takes f3, a gratuitous sacrifice of the bishop it seems, but black's idea is to go queen c4, and this is a surprisingly difficult move to meet. We're going to be taking a look in the next game at various continuations for white from this position, but in my opinion none of them give him any sort of advantage. Herzog tries a very dubious move here, bishop e3. He's trying to, by sacrificing a pawn, get some chances against the black queen. For instance, white's threatening a move like rook c1 here. But black plays very accurately. He plays queen c4 to extricate his queen, and then he goes knight ge7, giving the knight on c6 reinforcements. Rook c1, and now Fleer captured on a2. Well, it's obvious that white's got to stir up some trouble pretty quickly, and he tried d5. Black put his knight in on e5, and now bishop e4. Otherwise that bishop would just be removed. And now black played f5. White must find something quick here, or he's going to be losing on material. He tried rook c2, black went queen b3, and now d6, opening up the game. And the point of d6 is that if black takes this, then we go rook c8 check, with a discovered attack against the unprotected black queen. Fleer is on the ball, and he goes rook d8. Queen h5 check g6, d takes e7, and then g takes h5. Saw white's position in ruins. We just dropped back to the position after rook d8. It was getting very difficult for white. I mean, his position is creaking. The pawn on d6 is pinned. Black's threatening rook takes d6. Black's also threatening to take this bishop off. Queen h5 check smacks of desperation. And now g6 just leaves too many white pieces attacked. So, summarising, I'm going to be recommending d5. This line can be used against both the Goring Gambit and the Danish Gambit, and is thus a multifunction idea. It worked well in this opening game. Let's go on in the next game to look at other things that white can do against it. In our first example, we saw a very efficient way to deal with the Danish Gambit. Black declines the Gambit, preferring the classical d5, a method recommended by Capablanca. The nice thing for us is that this method can be used also against the Scotch Gambit. So what I'm going to do is to wind the game back to the start, and we're going to have a look at a game from the Guernsey Open in 2009 between Ian Heppel, an English player who's graded about 2100, and Grandmaster Oleg Kornaev, where this was in fact the move order. Scotch Gambit move order. Heppel played 3d4, e takes d4, now c3. Well, d5 is equally playable here, and should transpose back into our favoured position. White generally takes this pawn, black recaptures. This is classical stuff by black, free flowing development. And white took on d4. Black pinned the knight on f3, and white played bishop e2. Now there is an interesting line here after knight c3. Against this move, I would probably prefer black just for an easy life to play bishop b4. This should take us back into our main line, but if you feel like speculating or playing a very sharp position, you can play bishop takes f3 here. Then we get knight takes d5, bishop takes d1, and white plunges in and takes the rook. The problem I have with this line from black's perspective is that actually it takes him quite some time to round up that knight on a8, if he rounds it up at all. For instance, the main line goes bishop d3, black plays bishop g6, takes, and now white plays a very good move here, king to d1. Well, it's only the exchange up in this position, and it looks as though his king could come under serious fire, but I think he can recuperate here with king c1, bishop d6 now, and rook d1. This is the type of thing that makes me think it's not quite so easy for black, this variation at all. The computers say this is good for white. Well, it's possible black might find an improvement in a variation like this, but it's also possible that this is good for white. But as I say, after knight c3, black can just go bishop b4. Returning to Heppel versus Kornaev, white played the standard bishop e2, and now we see the check, knight c3, takes, and now Capablanca's idea, queen c4. Frustrating white in his desire to castle and putting pressure on c3. You'll note also that d4 is under pressure. Now this variation, from white's perspective, took on a lease of life about 30-40 years ago when Leonard Barden recommended it for white in the Guardian chess book, and he gave loads of interesting possibilities for white. He felt that the main line then, as it is now, is probably bishop takes c6 check, but now, as then, black gets a good game by carefully recapturing with the pawn. This is an important move, keeping the black queen on an awkward square in the middle of white's camp. Better than queen takes c6. Just going back to queen c4, queen b3 has also been played, but there I think after queen takes b3 and then knight ge7, black gets a very comfortable game. If white castles, threatening knight b5, black can play the careful a6, and if rook a4, we go bishop d6, with a better position for black. I prefer black despite white's 2 bishops because of white's fragmented pawn structure. So going back to queen c4, we've got bishop takes c6 check, b takes c6, and now white tries to get a better endgame after queen e2. The problem is that this is not an endgame, it's still a middle game despite the absence of the queens, and black has very active play against white's king here. He's immediately putting pressure on d4, this is the theoretical line by the way, and now so white plays bishop e3. And now black profits from not yet having developed that knight on g8 by playing his knight to e7. The Grandmaster treats this position in a model way. After rook h d1, black played rook h e8 with the idea of knight f5. This is the problem for white. He can't nail the position down. He's got to... It takes him quite some time to nail the position down. For instance, Heppel played rook ac1, black played knight f5, again renewing the threat to this pawn on d4. And white's really got to play a move like king f3 in order to extricate himself from the threats. But now Kornaev played another excellent move, rook to d6, not only protecting the pawn against on c6 from attack, introducing ideas along the third rank to further attack the white king. Heppel gave his king a square, and now another idea from black, bishop a5. Now white's pawn on d4 is under fire, thanks to the simple idea of bishop b6. And rook d6 has also enabled Kornaev to play rook e d8. So it may well be that white actually can't even save his pawn on d4 in this position, even here. Knight a4 was answered by bishop b6. Black doesn't mind at all if white plays knight takes b6, reconnecting black's pawns. Instead, white played rook c4, and black doubled up on d4. So there we are, this pawn is going down the drain. King e4 was answered instructively by rook f6. And king d3, well, if bishop to g5 in this position, at the very least, black has rook e8 check. King d3 was answered by bishop takes d4. Bishop takes d4, knight takes d4, and white saw to dismay that if he goes rook takes d4, we just take it and go rook d6 check, winning. So Heppel played rook dc1 and simultaneously resigned this position, as knight b3 discovered check, wins the house. So just summarising, going back, our idea of a quick d5 works against both the Danish gambit and the Goring gambit. In this game, we saw that the d5 break enabled black to develop freely and easily, and it gives black an easy life. And this is why I can strongly recommend this method to you. Well, we now move on to taking a look at the dangerous King's Gambit. Clearly this is an opening which has to be respected, and is still being used at the highest level. Why, in the last 18 months, I've seen players of excellence of Magnus Carlsen use it, Nigel Short continues to use it, and I've even seen Nakamura use it. And if these volatile grandmasters are employing the King's Gambit, then it is still a worthy prospect. On this DVD, I'm going to concentrate on a response which is fairly simple to understand and execute in keeping with the theme of this repertoire. And my suggestion starts with the move d5, the Faulkbeer counter gambit. The nice thing about the Faulkbeer is it tends to force white to play e takes d5, as other moves give him absolutely nothing. It's worth noting at this early stage that f takes e5 is catastrophic for white, and in fact loses the game after queen h4 check. Well, should lose the game. So, back to d5, e takes d5, and now here comes our little surprise. The normal move in the Faulkbeer is to go e4 here, or even c6, the Nimzowitsch counter gambit, but I recommend e takes f4. This is a very useful transpositional device. Going back into, let's see, another line, let's go back to f4. Black takes on f4. Now, white can play the bishop's gambit here, bishop c4, and if black went d5 in this position, then bishop takes d5 is quite a good move, and again is being played at a high level. The nice thing about our move order is that by forcing white to take on d5 at this early stage, we've avoided that awkward variation of the bishop's gambit. And in fact what we've gone back into is the d5 line of the king's knight's gambit, where with black threatening queen h4 check here, white's more or less got to go knight f3, and now black goes knight f6, and we're back in what we want. I've always felt the d5 variation to be very thematic for black. Black opens up the game at the earliest stage. He's got free flowing development for all his pieces, which is exactly what we want, and yeah, this is quite a good line for black. The biggest danger to black is that, well, white's got extra central pawns, and white can use these pawns in the middle game to try and push the active black minor pieces back. So that's the danger that black has got to be aware of when he plays this system. Now I'm going to show you some games which hopefully will nullify white's ideas, and the first of these comes from the Sydney Open, played in April 2012, between Multhon Lee, who's grades 2402, I imagine he's an international master, and Leventi Vaidya, whose grade is 2597, so I imagine he is a grandmaster. And in this game, Lee played the modern move, bishop c4. That's the move recommended by Gallagher in books on the King's Gambit, and has more or less superseded bishop b5 check in this position as white's main move. Obviously we'll be taking a look at bishop b5 check in future cuts. But after bishop c4, black sticks with the orthodox knight takes d5, and already I quite like black's position. The main line suggests that white should surrender the bishop pair here with bishop takes d5, but I don't consider this to be particularly dangerous to black. We're going to see a game of Michael Adams a bit later on, where after knight c3, which is a fairly obvious move, he puts his queen on f5 and absolutely crushes a guy called Robert Eames in the British Championship 2010. There, later on, after developing his pieces, black managed to launch a kingside pawn storm against the white king. So presumably, going back to Lee versus Vaidya, that's why white castles in this position, trying to avoid that variation. Knight c6 was played, and only now did white play knight c3. And I presume there is some move order trick for white if black plays queen f5 here, so Vaidya decided to put his queen on h5. White played queen e2 check, and black plays bishop e6. So no problem whatsoever with initial development. We're getting all our pieces out very quickly. It seems to me that black can castle on either side. He's also got a possible plan, if he castles on the queen side, of actually getting this kingside pawn storm together. d4. Let's also not forget that white has yet to regain his pawn. White's still a pawn down in this position. And whilst the pawn on f4 is not a particularly strong pawn, it does stop the white pieces from coming out to their best squares. So white had better get his pawn back quickly. Well, Vaidya castles. Okay, this is a common sense idea, just giving white back his pawn in order to complete development. Classical chess. Please note that due to the unprotected black queen on h5, knight takes d4 was not yet possible. White just takes, and black cannot recapture due to the fact that his queen is attacked. So bishop b4, the black pieces are streaming out. And already I slightly prefer black's game. He's got two bishops. He's putting pressure on white's position. There are definite ideas of rook h e8 there, putting pressure on the white queen. White's got to be very concrete here if he wants to develop any play. So that's why Lee plays knight b5, hitting c7, which black protects with bishop a5. And now white starts to get those central pawns rolling. I mentioned at the outset, this is probably the main theme behind white's play in this line. Well, black's main theme is rapid, pointed development. So rook h8 points the finger at the white queen. So the white queen steps aside. All very logical so far. a6. Well, of course, if the white knight moves, then d4 drops. So white's got to enter a tactical sequence here after d5. Black took the white knight. And now, of course, the problem for white is that if he takes on c6 here, then the c4 pawn is hanging. And perhaps the best way for black to exploit that is to go queen c5 check first. And I think that will win a pawn in broad daylight. So white didn't like that, and he took the bishop on e6, whereupon black took back. White took on b5, black recaptured. White took on h7, it's all getting very tactical, and black took on b2. So the smoke is starting to clear. White played bishop g5, black played rook d e8, and black is a pawn up. Admittedly, there are open files on the queen side towards his king, but I think I'd much rather be black in this position, a pawn up, with no real danger to the king, than in white's position. Well, white played queen f5, and decent move, bringing the queen up, hitting that pawn on f7, and black decided to play knight e5 in this position. King h1. Well, clearly white was getting afraid of ideas such as bishop b6 check, and of course if knight takes e5 in this position, well, this is quite a nice position for black. We can recapture with the queen, and white still can't take on f7. So white parks his king in the corner, away from tactics, and black plays g6. Another interesting and tactically motivated move. Queen f4 was answered by knight takes f3, and now white is struggling to find a good reply. Basically, I think if white recaptures with the queen here, then we've got f5, which is a good move, and, well, tends to nullify white's attack. So white took with a pawn, but now came f6. Queen a4, and now queen b4. Another sensible move, forcing off the queens. And suddenly, white basically has a lost position here. I mean, he ends up a pawn down for nothing. White's king is also in a worse position for the endgame, so black plays rook e1 quite naturally, just intending to swap off all the pieces. It's very, very simple now. When you're winning, you don't take risks. Well, white just enters a completely lost bishop endgame. He's got to keep the bishops on. Black brings his king up. And that was the last move of the game. When you're playing a grandmaster, these positions really shouldn't be played on. This is going to be child's play for the grandmaster. He's just going to find some way of exploiting that passed pawn on c7. So just to recap and summarise, so far, against the King's Gambit, I'm recommending that black employ a move order trick, going in via the fork beer to force white to play e takes d5, and then to play the free-flowing e takes f4. This will form the basis of our approach. In the last video, we saw a very interesting move order against the King's Gambit. Black first employs the fork beer move order, more or less forcing white to play e takes d5, and then he goes e takes f4. A very useful transpositional device which avoids certain awkward lines of the bishop's gambit. Well, we're now going to look at another game in this line between Ian Snape and Adrian Demuth. The black player is an international master with a grade of 2,442, and this game was played in the Hastings Masters in January 2012. In view of black's immediate threat of queen to h4 check here, white's reply knight f3 is almost forced, and now we get a main line very similar to our first example, where white brings his bishop out to c4. There is another move here, bishop b5 check. We'll be dealing with that next. Black fluently takes on d5, and now in our next game, this game, actually white castles. He doesn't take the knight off on d5. Well, against this, I think black has two good moves. Demuth played is a good one, bishop to e6. Black can also play bishop to e7 in this position. That's quite reasonable, and usually white goes d4, black castles, and then white gets his pawn back, something like this, takes, and takes on f4. Black plays queen d8. I think this position is also reasonable for black. Probably takes a little bit of care to play it, although black's got two nice bishops. This is perfectly playable. It's not so easy for white to work up an advantage here, but he does have the open f-file. Going back to Snape Demuth, bishop e6, well, shores up the knight on d5, blocks the e-file. In every respect, it's a good move, and might set up ideas such as the sudden and surprising move knight e3, which could nab the two bishops. So that's why white goes bishop b3 in this game, taking away black's tactics, and only now does black play bishop e7. So just to repeat, the main danger to black in this position is an advance of the central pawns by white, which could cause black's minor pieces some confusion. But as long as black's ready to answer c4 with knight e3, I mean, we actually see this in action. If white goes d4, black can castle in this position, white goes c4. Well, here I think black is ready to plunge his knight in. He almost certainly knows he's going to lose that pawn on e3, but again, in return, he's going to get two nice bishops. He's also going to get some pressure on the dark squares, because now the bishop on e7 has suddenly become a very strong piece. If white tries to continually interrupt the flow of black's game, then he can fall into difficulty. And one way to do this after d5 would be to play bishop c5. That immediately threatens e2 check, winning the queen, so white's probably got to play queen e2. And then just simple development will do something like bishop g4 pinning, queen e7 stopping white from going knight e4, knight d7, something like this. White moves in to regain his pawn and black doesn't let him. This will be a typical move sequence in this variation, by which black gets a very comfortable game. So going back to Snape versus Demuth, white plays c4 straight away. And we can understand his motivation for that. He simply doesn't want to let the knight into e3. But of course, after knight b6, we note that suddenly this pawn is under fire on c4. And in fact, Snape lets this pawn go. Now, the thing is, white doesn't really want to go playing a move like d3 in this position. I mean, that is a very, very passive move, and it makes this bishop on b3 look very bad. You know, black has two ways to play this position. He can just concentrate his fire on d4 here, maybe play a move like c5 and knight c6. He could even play the very combative move g5 here. White's playing so slowly that black can maybe go in for this. And suddenly this is a very difficult position for white. So going back to Snape versus Demuth, this is why white gambited the pawn with d4. Black was happy to take it, and now knight to c3. This is a typical King's Gambit solution to the problem. Instead of going passive, white goes active. He introduces the threat of d5 into the position, which is going to win a piece. And basically, he's just going to hope to get this pawn back and get a nice active game. Well, Demuth played knight d6. White took on e6 and played queen to e2. And now black played a pragmatic move, castles. Basically, this is a classic way to treat gambits. You give back the material you have gained to get a good position. In this case, black gives up the e-pawn, tuck his king away in the corner, and then he says to white, well, what have you got here? Well, Snape moves in with the knight, a double attack on the bishop and the pawn at f4. Black defends the knight with the pawn, the bishop with the knight, and now white goes bishop takes f4. So the position is starting to clarify. Black has given both the pawns he gained back in order to get a good game. And now he starts to concentrate his fire on the pawn at d4. A very sharp move, because Demuth has calculated that he can allow this move, knight takes c7. At first sight, this looks extremely scary after bishop takes d6. But black's point is that he plays a sudden and surprising move, knight takes d4. Now this is quite interesting. Probably after long thought, white went knight takes d4. Now he can try the desperado move here, queen takes f6. And then I think black should continue knight takes f3 check. Now white has two moves, but neither of them give the advantage. If he goes queen takes f3, that's just a serious mistake. Black goes queen b6 check and wins. So better for white after knight takes f3 check is to tuck the king away in the corner, and then we get the sequence rook takes f6, bishop takes c7, and now another little intermezzo by black, rook to c8. Obviously black gets a slightly better rook endgame if white plays rook takes f3, so white retains his bishop. Now knight g5, and you would think perhaps that white could build up a small edge here, but it's very difficult. If black plays accurately, he moves his rook into c4 with ideas of rook a4. If b3 we go rook c6, and it's very, very difficult for white to claim any advantage whatsoever. In fact, I imagine this will be a draw. Black's nicely centralised and gets ready to move his king over to f7 and then rook to c2. So, Snape had plenty to think about. He went knight takes d4. Black took on d4 check. King went into the corner. Black got rid of his difficulty with rook takes f1. Check. Rook takes f1. Queen c6. And after rook e1, bishop takes b2. The smoke was clearing and black was still a pawn up. Both sides gave their king a bit of air, and white played bishop g3. I mean, essentially this is a normal position with black a pawn up. It's the type of endgame we had earlier, but black has an extra pawn. Snape seeks refuge in a rook endgame. Of course, black is happy to take rook b8, And now the theatre of action will be on the queen side. White is struggling to contain black. Black will create a passed pawn on the queen side and hopefully win the game as a result. After rook e7, black played a6, rook a7, and now rook b6. And white started to bring his king across. Now rook c6 was answered by a3, and black brought his king up. White played g3, black fixed the pawns on the king side, king h3, and now king f6. White seems to have found an uncomfortable box for his king. Of course, the problem is the king could not move out because there was a check on c2 to worry about. So g6, rook f8 check king e5, rook f4, rook b6, getting ready to create that passed pawn. That is the overall aim. And after king f3, a mistake, probably prompted by time trouble, rook f6 won the game. Just going back to a5, difficult for white to do better because black's just going to go b4, and that will be that really. You're threatening to push the pawn all the way down. White will probably have to move his rook across to b1, and then the black king moves in, as the black king is closer to the passed pawn than the white king. So just to summarise our initial thoughts on the king's gambit, we're playing a tricky move order, the fork beer, looks good, and now e takes f4, threatening queen h4 check. We've seen lines, modern lines, where white's going bishop c4. I mean, that's more or less what they all do these days. It superseded the move bishop b5, check, which is the old-fashioned move. But there seems no reason why black shouldn't be perfectly okay here with a straightforward knight takes d5. Okay, well now we're going to take a look at a very interesting game from the World Cup in Khanty-Mansiysk. This was an event which featured many of the world's best players. It was in 2007, and we're going to look at a game between Vadim Zviagintsev, a very strong grandmaster, graded 2674, and Abhijit Kunte, grandmaster from India. And it featured, this game, the old-fashioned way to meet d5 in the King's Gambit. Remember our move order? We're going to d5, we're obliging white to take on d5, and then we're flicking in e takes f4. This is our move order, which avoids awkward variations of the bishop's gambit. White went knight f3, black went knight f6, and now bishop b5 check. This was the old-fashioned way to meet this variation. I remember a very famous game of Boris Spassky where he played against Bill Hartston from England in this variation. And we're going to adopt Spassky's move here. Black should play c6 in this position, and after d takes c6, this is really the parting of the ways, where black has to decide how he's going to recapture. And I'm recommending capturing with the knight. Just a fluid move, getting the pieces out, and preparing an idea like bishop to d6. And this was what happened in Zviagintsev versus Kunte. Of course, black can take with the pawn. That's a reasonable move as well. But I think knight takes c6, if black can get away with it, is the most straightforward. Again, just to remind you, the major danger to black in this position is a sudden advance of the d and c pawns by white. White's got a central pawn majority here, 4-2. This has got to be respected. And black must be careful his pieces just don't get driven back by the advancing white pawns. To offset this, black has quite a nice little pawn majority there on the king side. And white's got to respect this as well, as we'll see in this game, because black can often advance this majority quickly and suddenly create an attack. Well, Zviagintsev played the principal move here, which is d4. Note white can already fall for a trap here if he stupidly castles in this position. Queen b6 check is a major accident. So white plays d4, and now the normal move here is bishop to d6. But Kunte sprang a little surprise here by playing his queen to a5 check, and this is the move I recommend. Now the point of this is to slow up the advance of these pawns, as white has to play knight c3 in this position to protect his bishop. Then black plays bishop b4, again concentrating on fluid development, and prepares to castle. So very straightforward so far. Both sides castle in this position, and now white brings his bishop back to d3. As he probably doesn't really want to surrender this bishop at this stage, I'm not sure playing bishop takes c6 actually helps white in this position. Black's again got a nice fluid game, and if white takes on f4, black can choose between bishop a6 or you can even just take the pawn back with bishop takes c3. This seems steadily equal for black, who can use these squares for his minor pieces. So Zviagintsev got his bishop out of the way, and now black played the same type of move, protecting that pawn on f4. Please remember that in this line in particular, that pawn on f4 can be awkward for white, and if he fails to get rid of it, it can inhibit his whole plan of development, because he can't get his pieces out to good squares. White would like to just fluidly take on f4, bring his queen to d2, rook a e1, something like that, and then knight e5, get a nice attack. Black is stopping him. So bishop d2, that's very understandable, and black shifts his queen across to h5. Quite a useful idea for black to keep his queen there on the 5th rank, or his 4th rank if you like, because it prepares to play g5. And that idea was seen immediately as white tried to come back to get his pawn back. Bang, g5. Now I suppose white was getting a little bit worried, because those pawns advancing towards his king looked rather menacing. So he played h3, whereupon black just completed his development. White played c4, that's part of the fundamental plan, and now rook fe8. Just a steady move, bringing the rook to the open file, and if c5, bishop f8 possibly, there'd be a nice square on d5 for the knight. So white avoids c5, just playing a3. And the point of that is clearly just to get his majority going with b4. So it's all very interesting stuff. Black completes his development with rook a d8. White plays b4, and now b6, just trying to hold white up for a little bit. And then came queen c2. And now a very interesting move here, quite uncompromising. Kunte went in for rook takes e2. Now clearly there are other ways to play this position, you don't need to play in this manner, but the idea is very bold. He answered then with g4. And the point of this is that if white takes this, then knight takes g4 launches a ferocious attack. There's already the threat of knight takes d4. Difficult for white to beat this attack back. Yeah, well, this is also very interesting. I mean, bishop f5 is also a move here, bishop e4. There are various plans on the table. So after long thought, Zviagintsev played bishop to c3. Kunte took, bishop takes, and I suppose white decided on this continuation just to keep his position together. Admittedly now black's got 2 pieces for the rook, but his pawns were a little bit ragged. The attack seems to have broken down, and white's still got this opposing pawn majority in the centre and on the queen side. So all in all, a very interesting position. Queen g5, and now rook e1. So at least white's completed his development, and black is seeking attacking options on the king side with knight h5. c5, well, this was always going to happen, and black tries to break the majority by taking it. D takes c5, opening up the bishop. Bishop f8, again a non-surprising move, just trying to protect the dark squares on the king side. Zviagintsev took on h5 and took on f4, and black played bishop e6. Queen f2, looks like black's got to be very careful how he defends his king in this position. Kunte brings the knight around. Well, knight d5 is an idea, knight g6 is an idea. White plays in the style of the king's gambit. He lops off the bishop and goes rook g4 check. Knight g6, queen f6. Well, this does look extremely menacing, but has white got any immediate winning moves, given that queen h8 is answered by king f7? Obviously white's on the rook 2 at d8, sorry, d8 next door, so black plays rook to e8. And it's amazing that black can get away with this, as the white now plays c6, but he can, and furthermore, he's starting to put on some pressure himself. c7, and now an amazingly cool move here, queen to g7. Queen takes e6 check, a desperado. It looks good, but rook c6 covers the base. Bishop e5, keeping the pawn, and now king f7. Bishop went back to g3, bishop g7, white played b5, no time to lose now, black's got to check to keep the game on the ball, and now pawn up to h5. It's remarkable that this is going to save the day, but save the day it does. as black is able to harry the white pieces in this position and buy time to bring his king back. Rook c6 was answered by rook takes c6, and a very strange position arose after king c8. White's only got, well, white's got 3 pawns for the piece, 2 of which are doubled. It doesn't seem like it should be enough. But black's king is tied up. White tries to break the shackles with g3. Black plays his knight to e5, trying to round up the pawns. a4, and now knight f7. Bishop f4, and now bishop h6. So black is keeping his knight there. G takes h4. He's hoping to round up the pawns with his king. Boom, boom, boom. And then advances a pawn. Very interesting and unbalanced endgame. Can he find the time? Knight f5 was played by Kunte. h5. King takes c7. The usefulness of knight f5, of course, lies mainly in the fact that it takes white an extra tempo to get his king into the game. So king g2, king takes c6, king f3. It's going to be a race. King f4, king e6, very interesting play here. King e4, knight g3 check, king d4, and now we get another strange position coming up here where white races across, but black stops the h pawn. Now, is black going to be able to run white out of moves? Knight f4, king c5, king b7, king b5. The problem with the knight is you can't gain a tempo with it. So knight h5, king c5, knight f6, king b5. This is essentially the same position as before. Black tries something. Now, can he win? White plays a5. It turns out that he cannot after king d5. The knight has to stay on its post, monitoring the advance of the h-pawn. So after knight h5, possibly Kunte felt he'd been a bit hard done by because he had to agree to a draw in this position. It's amazing that black can't make progress, but I don't think he can. White can maintain the opposition. And so Zviagintsev scrambled to the draw. Just going back, bishop b5 check interests us in the opening. That's the old-fashioned move. We're going c6, and now we're taking fluidly with the knight. And don't forget, after d4, queen a5 check is a very interesting reply. Well, we saw in the last game that Kunte obtained a very reasonable position after white played d4 and black played queen a5 check. Is there any way that white can avoid that variation? Well, let's turn our attention now to the games Latic versus Lazic, played in the Serbian Championship in Zlatibor in 2006. Both of these guys are strong international masters. White played bishop b5 check, as we've seen. Black played c6. White takes, and now black fluidly recaptures with the knight. This is the variation I'm recommending to you. And white now played knight c3. Well, clearly black's got to now find another approach, because queen a5 in this position isn't quite as good. It doesn't really have any impact on the situation. The nice thing about our variation is that it does allow black's pieces to flow out fluently. So Lazic played the sensible move, bishop to d6, and both sides castled. At the moment, this position is quite deceptive. I mentioned that the biggest danger to black in this position is the eventual advance of these 2 pawns, hopefully to knock the black minor pieces out of the way as these pawns advance towards the back rank. Black, for his part, as I say, must keep things very fluid, must try to get kingside pressure, must try to retain this pawn on f4, I think, because that pawn is a bit of a bone in white's throat. As long as that pawn gets there, it's difficult for white to get his queenside pieces out to good squares. So bishop d6 is very thematic. White now goes d4, and black played again the very fluid move, bishop g4. This is a very typical deployment for black in this situation. And now Zlatic played bishop takes c6. Well, one can condemn that premature perhaps, but black's pretty significant pressure on white's centre, and we see now the effect, the cramping effect of this pawn on f4 is quite considerable. If white tries to get rid of it by playing knight to e2, then black should shore it up again with queen c7. And if h3, bishop h5, c4, then rook a d8. And I quite like black's position here. Black has a nice, easy, fluid game, and all the pieces are developed. difficult for white. I mean, he can try to initiate tactics, something like this. He can take on c6. Black's got to recapture with the pawn to keep f4 under observation. White pushes forward, takes, and the idea is bishop takes f4. So at the cost of the bishop pair, white has managed to get rid of that pesky pawn on f4. But after bishop d6, I still like black. If white takes on d6, black just recaptures with the queen. This seems very easy for black. The pawn on d4 is easily as weak as the pawn on c6. Black's next move, I imagine, is something like rook fe8. Very easy. Going back to bishop g5. That could also be a move for white. Now rook fe8, takes on f6, takes back, rook c1, queen e7. Again, black's pawns are in an awful position, 5 isolated and double pawned. But he has the bishop pair, and he has, I think, by far the better game here. You know, black is in the ascendancy. So already, I think, due to black's fluid development, white doesn't have an easy choice here. And so Zlatic takes on c6 and then plays queen to d3. With that move, he's just planning to get his pieces out. Bishop d2 and then rook a e1. He can't see a better way to do it. Black, for his part, takes the file. White plays bishop d2 and now queen to b6. Knight g5. Well, I think if white had seen black's next move, he wouldn't have ventured this excursion into the black half of the board. But on the other hand, black is absolutely fine in this position. He's getting ready for moves like rook a d8, b2 at some point will be hanging. Nothing wrong with this position for black at all. But knight g5 was answered by the splendid move bishop e5. And now I think white might be in a spot of bother. White is certainly not better in this position. If anything, he's worse. And his position continues to get worse with the exchange of queens. Rook takes f4 and now rook a d8. So I would argue this position is no advert for the king's gambit. After 16 moves, black's got the bishop pair. He's got all his pieces in play. Admittedly, he has a slight weakness on the queen side in terms of pawn structure, but it's very difficult for white to get at this. And by far the most important feature of the position is the wide open play and black's two bishops. White doubled. Black played bishop h5. White played knight f3. And black retreated the attacked bishop. Bishop c1. And now this was the point of playing bishop h5 in the first place. The bishop comes to g6, attacking c2. Rook c4 was answered by bishop takes c2, and rook takes c6 by bishop d3. Black has no objection to open play in this situation. Rook e1, and now black takes a little bit of time out to free up the back rank with h6. White does the same, takes, and now white puts, black plays a very tactical move, quite an interesting move here, bishop to e4, inviting and enticing complications, which white ducks by playing rook to c4. Now it's clear this can't change the situation very much. Black is still quite a bit better after rook c4. So I wonder whether white can change things with rook takes f6. It's one of those tactical situations where you really do have to calculate. At first sight it looks very straightforward. White's got two pieces for the rook. But rook d1 is clearly Lazic's intention. But we can take play on a little bit here. Bishop d2. This is quite interesting play. Just goes to show you the depth to which some players calculate. Bishop comes to c3. Alright, well, obviously rook takes e1 is no solution. Then I think white will be happy to get a good bishop ending. But the idea is quite deep. King g6. And that knight on... Well, white's in a bit of a mess here. His knight on f6 is being completely dominated. He's got nowhere to go. It's a very strange position. If white tries to get out of the pin, we go check g3 and then bishop d8. And you can see this is how deep the guy calculated. Very impressive. If knight e8, f6. The knight continues to be trapped. Black's threatening king c7. And despite the fact that white's got two pieces here, he can't unravel the situation. So this, if you like, after bishop e4 was a very deep trap. Rook c4, bishop b7. Okay, well, not much changes now. Black's just got a very, very good game here with the bishop pair in an open position. You'd think that white would have some way to save this game, but it's tough because the black pieces are just flowing into white's game. On top of everything else, white's got a weak king position. Bishop c6, rook c4, and now black has chosen a good moment to take on f3. He nudged the rook off the a file, he goes in and wins a pawn. So I think from a situation where white was now worse, he's gone to a situation where I think he's clearly lost. Black brings up his king, safeties his bishop, and plays his rook to c2. It's a consolidatory phase here where black is just trying to anchor the position. Black plays a5, white goes rook b5, rook c3, nasty, hitting 2 pawns, rook b7, f6, why give white anything, bishop a7, and now the harvest. Rook takes h3 check, and rook d3. Rook b5 was answered by rook takes b3, and bishop d4 by rook d3. Bishop b6, h5, freeing up the king. It really is a position where black should resign. I guess he doesn't resign because he's feeling frustrated. In comes the black king. Up it comes. Really, this is a resignable position. Black has 3 extra pawns. The game goes on. 4 extra pawns. 3. Rook b7, rook h8, a4. When it gets like this, it gets a bit silly. Bishop c1, rook c7. Final resignation. White resigns. Obviously, you can take this. Takes. This is completely hopeless. g5, or even let's see, rook c4. Either of these moves win easily. So, just going back to bishop b5 in the opening, c6 takes. We've seen d4. We've seen knight c3. Against each of these continuations, black has pretty good chances with fluid piece play and quick development. To close our discussion of the King's Gambit, we must take a look at what happens when white tries to steer the game into a kind of Bishop's Gambit type of position. You'll recall our move order involves the fork beer. That forces white to take on d5. Now we're going e takes f4. And now if white insists on the Bishop's Gambit with bishop c4, well, I think the best move is simply knight f6 here. It is very tempting in a position like this to go queen h4 check. And in fact, grandmasters of the calibre of Topalov have been doing that in the last couple of years. But in fact, Topalov lost a game to Polgar, Judith Polgar, I recall, in this variation. So, don't let's be tempted with that type of move. This is obviously playable for black queen h4 check. But that's the type of unclear adventure I'm striving to avoid. Instead, let's prefer knight f6 and ask white how he's going to deviate from the stuff we've looked at already. If he goes knight f3, we go knight takes d5, we're back in our favourite opening. If he goes knight c3, obviously this is slightly more of a challenge. And now the right move for black in this position is bishop out to d6. Then probably white's best move is just to go knight f3, castles, castles, and we get a position very similar to our main lines when black now plays the key move, the freeing move, c6. Of course, black has some challenges to face in this position due to the lack of queenside development. So c6 is an attempt to solve all these problems at a stroke. And in fact, after d takes c6, we're going to play knight takes c6, a fluid move, very much in keeping with what we've been looking at so far. And now black more or less has transposed back into our favoured main line. So white cannot get any advantage by playing a Bishop's Gambit move order as long as we stick to our guns. And now comes the game Khrushchev versus Barlocco from the Kaola Open in 1982. An old game, a game between two unknown players, but very thematic for our needs. You must always try to seek out games which are relevant to the theme in hand, not necessarily with the biggest names you can find. Well, after d4, black played bishop g4. Fluid development, and now white played knight e2. We've seen this before. He's trying to get after that pawn on f4. And black keeps the pawn with the instructive move, queen c7. After bishop b3, rook fe8 was played, and after c4, as stated before many times, these pawns are a big danger to black in this variation. Barlocco completes development with rook a d8. So this straightforward type of play is, I think, very, very useful for the club player to adopt into his games. It's a classical approach, just getting all the pieces out. That pawn on f4 is difficult for white to shift, and basically black has a very, very reasonable position here. And he also notes that c5 is answered by bishop takes c5. That's the main point behind rook a d8. Well, apart from it just being a very good move, of course. So white plays bishop d2 here, and he's getting ready for the advance of one of his pawns. Bishop takes f3. I wonder whether Kirstev saw that move. The point of it is that black's simply going to take on d4 in this position. White took back with the pawn. Well, that's a miserable move, but the point is that rook takes f3 is answered by rook takes e2. That's a bit of a cruncher here, and then knight takes d4. And that's the tactical shot which white is trying to avoid when he plays g takes f3, but that cannot be inspiring, and in fact black played a lovely move here. Knight takes d4. What is white to do? If he takes bishop c5, bishop c3, we just go queen b6. Black regains material with interest, and that king's gambit bishop on b3 is looking like an overgrown pawn. So I think we can say that after knight takes d4, white's probably losing this position. He tried knight c3, knight takes b3, takes bishop c5, but you know, you've got to feel a bit sorry for Kirstev. He's not the first player to fall foul of black's fluid development in this line. Well, as the game went, it just got worse. You know, black won another pawn. Queen c1 was white's futile attempt to escape. Well, at least he doesn't lose a piece in this line. But queen d7 retains all of black's trumps. 2 extra pawns. A massive dominating attack. There's no way back for white. Black just tidies up at the back with h6. White sets a few cheapos. The cheapos are not going to work in this position. Queen d6 threatens mate. Queen d5, king g1. And now black moved him for the kill with queen f3. White resigned. So a very clear demonstration of black's fluid development, black's plans and chances in this line. A game which shows that the bishop's gambit move order is not dangerous to black. Well, moving on then from the king's gambit, we come now to a cousin, or at least a very close relative, the Vienna game, where white plays 2 knight c3. Now, I believe that against the Vienna, black's soundest move is just to play knight f6, also the sharpest move and the most promising move too. We are not afraid of, as I say, the closest cousin to the king's gambit, the Vienna gambit with f4, and I believe leaving options open for black with the c-pawn, in particular the option of, if necessary, going c6 and then d5 is profitable for black. Why block the c-pawn with knight c6 when you don't need to? Well, there are various options for white after knight f6, and of course the sharpest one is f4. As we've just been dwelling on the king's gambit, it makes sense to look at this first, and black should reply with d5. That is the tried and trusted move, and it's a move which achieves good results for white. Has to take on e5 in this position. We get knight takes e4 coming, and now there are 2 moves. White can either play knight f3, which is the if you like the safest move, or he goes d3, entering into sharp complications. Either way, black is absolutely fine. Now, in the first game I'm going to show you, in fact it's an extremely recent game as I record this. It was played in the Siegerman tournament on the 16th of May 2012 between Grandmasters Johnny Hector and Fabio Caruna. Hector, of course, is a very romantic player, and it's no surprise to see him at the helm of some sharp variation in the open game. He's been doing this, you know, throughout his entire life. He enjoys this type of fight. Here he finds Caruna on top form. Obviously after knight f3, black has loads of choice. Bishop e7 is a very decent move. Black has bishop f5. There are lots of moves. Caruna chooses a straightforward move. He just gets his pieces out. He plays knight c6, and after bishop to b5, he goes bishop b4, and both sides castle. So now white has to ask himself, well, what do I have in this position? What have I got? The point of bishop b4 was to tie down that pawn and make it difficult for white to clarify the position in the centre. If white pushes the d pawn, black's going to snap off that pawn on c3 and actually win something. So white has got a fairly awkward choice to make here. Note that he cannot make use of the open f file in this particular position. Black is absolutely fine. Hector went knight to e2, making room, one presumes, for ideas such as c3. Well, Caruna continued to develop his pieces. This is the type of straightforward play I like in the open game, rapid pointed development. Try and create threats as you go along, but on no account play passively. This is the ethos we're trying to incorporate into our game as we go through this e4, e5 repertoire. And perhaps slightly surprisingly, Hector decided to take on c6 straight away. Now, in order to try and understand why he does this, it's worthwhile examining c3, because that looks like the most natural move, and then I think black should certainly drop his bishop back to e7. Well, again, you take a look at this position and you really think to yourself, well, white hasn't got anything here. You know, black's got a very nice, comfortable game. If white plays d3, then I imagine black can just play knight g5 with pressure. If he goes bishop takes c6 now, and then d3, we can even drop our knight back to c5. And if bishop e3, queen d7, knight e d4, a5, something like this, black is absolutely fine out of the opening. Bishop pair and a nice position. So Hector, going back to the game, took on c6, and he put his king in the corner, presumably taking away some of black's supposed tactics. Karuna went knight g5, and now white went d3, whereupon black played f6. That's always the slight drawback in having this pawn on e5. It is subject to being undermined, and this is the effect of the move f6 in this position. If black were to leave that pawn on e5 for any length of time, then it could actually obstruct him in his natural development. So Karuna hits hard before white gets fully developed. Now, I presume the reason he plays this complicating move is precisely that. He wants a difficult position. He wants to get to a position where he can outplay Johnny Hector. There was a simpler way here, just by taking on f3 and then going bishop f5. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But I presume he didn't do this because of knight d4, queen d7. Well, maybe white could just take that bishop off and thereby make a draw. Karuna's f6 is anti-drawish and promotes an unbalanced position. Just taking this on a little bit, as I say, white could have taken on f5 in this position, perhaps queen e2, rook a, e8. If he insists on playing for a sharp position, then I think this tends to favour black. But as I say, white could have taken on f5 a couple of moves ago. Certainly this position here is pretty good for black. So Karuna could have played that way. Instead he plays f6. This allows Hector to take on g5. Play c3. Now we get a very unbalanced position here. Again, it should be okay for black, but it's much sharper than before. So after queen a4, black went bishop d7. Knight d2. Well, you would think that a move like bishop d7 invites the sharp response e6, bishop e8, queen g4, something like this. But has white really got any threats in this position? For instance, what if black plays c5 here, confidently taking charge in the centre of the board? If white goes c4, can we play h5 and drive white back, rook b8 and then rook b6, something like this? You cast your eye around for a white threat. It's not immediately obvious how white is going to proceed in a position like this. So I've no doubt at all that Hector would have looked at e6 for quite some time. In the end, he decides to go knight d2, but this is rather passive and allows black to take over the position. Karuna comes forward with his c5. Hector takes on f8, simplifying, and plays queen b3, but this doesn't interrupt the natural flow of the bishop pair. Bishop f5 was answered by c4, and throughout this game, Karuna plays very energetically. He hits the queen, he blocks the centre, and now queen e8, targeting that pawn on e5. At no stage has that pawn ever been a threat to Karuna. Knight g3 was answered by bishop g6, and rook e1 by g4, cramping white on the king side. h3. Well, that is a rather miserable looking move, but I suppose Hector could see possible back rank tricks coming up, and he decided to try and free up his back rank. I mean, I think black's plan in this position is just to target that pawn, something like this, rook b8 to b6 and then rook e6. Very difficult for white, now that the f3 square has been taken away from the knight by the pawn on g4, to actually protect that pawn. If he goes knight b3 in this position, then queen a4 is a good move. Again, getting active, and white's position looks very uncoordinated to me. So Hector went h3, queen e6, takes. You have to ask yourself, has this helped white in any way? Well, I don't think so. And black continues to enjoy a great deal of activity here. Karuna shunted his bishop over to h4. Queen d1, even the exchange of the queens did not halt the black initiative. Bishop h5 pinning, bishop g5. That's the final triumph of the bishop pair over the knight pair in this position. White is simply losing material, and so he decided to resign. So our first investigation into the move f4 shows that whilst it's an idea which must be given respect, black's simple idea of d5 and then knight takes e4, in this case after knight f3, knight c6, followed by quick development of the bishops, gives him very satisfactory play. Well, let's continue our survey of the Vienna Gambit, the closest cousin really to the King's Gambit that I think is known in opening theory. We're playing d5, that's the approved move. White takes on e5, black takes on e4 with a nice fluid game. And now let's just take a look at the Oxford variation with d3, which I don't think troubles black unduly as long as he sticks to the basics. In fact, I'm going to show you a nice effective way of turning the tables on white in this line. The first point to note is that when white plays d3, he just wants black to get involved in the crazy positions that arise after queen h4 check. Then white goes g3, black takes on g3, knight f3, queen h5, and now knight takes d5. I strongly recommend you do not touch this variation with black at all. White wins most of the games. A crazy position arises in the main line, and that's exactly what white wants. You're playing into his hands if you play this variation. I never believe that playing into the enemy hands is a good idea, and so we're going to stick with the sensible knight takes c3 in this position, and then pawn up to c5. I believe this is an excellent way of playing this line, and gives black a very good position. The main line goes knight f3, knight c6, bishop e2, bishop e7, and now white castles, after which black plays bishop e6. Well, this is, in my opinion, a very sensible way to play for black. Black's retaining flexibility about castling. He hasn't committed his king yet. He could easily go long, and as I've marked out on the board there, black's thinking about playing g5. I used this plan very effectively in, I remember an early game that I played as a young man, and this was at club level. The white player just did not expect that black would play g5 in this position. White thinks he's got a right to the initiative here. His main plan in this position is to go queen e1, get the queen out to g3, and start an attack against the black king. But what if black hasn't castled on the king side? So it turns out that actually queen e1, I wouldn't say it's a mistake in this position, but certainly going on with queen g3 is just no good. Black goes g4, and wherever white puts his knight, black's following up with h5, with what I think is a terrific position. Black's going to go queen d7, he's going to cast on the queen side, and he's just going to get on with the king side pawn storm. h4, big attack. That's how quickly white can slip into a poor position in this line. There was an old game, Olsen versus Johansson, Helsingborg, 1991, where after queen e1 g5, white went c4. But black just took it. Rook b1, knight b4, and already black had the better position. White played king h1, black played g4, knight d2, c takes d3, takes, black was on top. So going back to our featured game, which brings me to our featured game, Bilsell versus Gawain. This is an old correspondence game. White played d4, trying to create some action in the centre. And now black could easily go on with the plan g5 here. This is very reasonable. Something like g4, queen d7, with the same ideas. I suppose white's got slightly better chances in this position than he had in the other line. Point number one, he's retained the d3 square for his knight. Point number two, he's already got the rook on a half open file, and possibly he can play bishop h6 here, which interrupts black's plan of h5. But even here, you know, castles g3, rook h d8, queen d2, queen c7, threatening queen to a5. This is okay for black. Gawain's approach in the game is more measured and deserves our attention. Black played h6, white went bishop e3, and now black blocked the position with c4. This reminds me of certain variations of the French, where you get this pawn formation in the centre, except that, of course, black's got no bad pieces. In the French, you often have this bad light squared bishop jamming up the works. Well, here, no such jam exists, and therefore, after rook b1, queen d7, queen e1, castles on the queen side, black already has a very comfortable game, and a very superior version of the French defence, if you can call it that. Bilsell went queen g3, and now seeing nothing, black just went on with the g5 plan. Now, this is a very easy plan to remember, you have to admit, and as you can see, he's turning the tables, because white has no initiative in this position. Black has numerous plans. Black is, well, the first plan is obvious. Black wants to swing the rook across to g8 and then just get on with the kingside pawn storm. The second plan, less obvious, is that actually black can play this position strategically, and he can even think of ideas such as knight a5 followed by queen a4. White has definite problems here with his queenside pawn configuration. So I think what I'm saying is this is actually a much more easy position for black to play than white, and therefore it's no surprise to see that in our featured game white slipped to defeat very quickly. Well, Gawain's played carefully. He first of all concentrated on securing his king position. He put his king on a8, rook fb1, and now rook b8. This is the type of play that often baffles club players. I mean, why is black, you know, fiddling around with stuff like this? Well, he just says, well, my position's just better than yours. You know, black's just saying, you've got numerous weaknesses on the queen side. All I have to do is secure my king position, and then I can go over to taking off your pawns. And that's exactly what happens in this game, as Gawain finds the excellent manoeuvre bishop d8 and then bishop a5. Then he plays knight d8. Well, white's got problems all over the shop. He tried rook f1. Black took on a4. Rook b1, maybe hoping for ideas such as rook a1 and then something like rook fb1. In a correspondence game, you can't really hope to get away with that play. And after queen d7, bishop f2, knight c6, Bilsell decided to resign, rather than waste any further time playing on this position. Okay, in an over-the-board game, you wouldn't resign this position as white, but white absolutely has no play whatsoever in this position. He's got the worst pawn structure. He's a pawn down. Black will just surely grind him down in this position, and in the correspondence game, you might be suffering for years in this position. So that's why white packed it in. So summarising, just going back to the opening, as long as black keeps it rational, the Oxford variation with d3 is no big deal. Black should take on c3 and then just go c5, getting the pieces out nice and easily, something like this, and then thinking about the move g5, which would quite take the wind out of white's sails. Continuing our discussion of the Vienna with g3, we now come to the game Elena Sedina versus Betul Yildiz, played in the European Women's Championship in 2011. Recommending d5 in this position. E takes d5, knight takes d5, and now the simple idea, Korchnai's idea, of taking on c3 and playing bishop d6. If you're following my repertoire for white with 1e4, you'll notice echoes of this variation, the line I'm recommending against the Scotch. Bishop d6, sticking with simple developments, preparing to castle, nothing fancy. Well, Sedina played knight f3, black castled, white castled, and now black plays c5. An interesting move, getting a bind on the centre, I would say. It's encouraging white to play d4, when black can choose between liquidating on d4 twice or playing e4, creating a complicated position. At any rate, Sedina just plays d3, and now black brings out the knight to c6. So here we have a sort of bind position on the centre, and black's development is not being interrupted. White played knight d2, black played bishop e6, white played knight e4, and now black played queen e7. So this is simple fare. She's just getting her pieces out. And with queen e7, she's protecting c5 one more time. So probably thinking about moves like bishop to c7 and then f5 at some point, which is why white interrupts the plan immediately by playing f4. Black takes on f4, white takes on d6, bishop takes f4, and now the queen comes to d7. Well, on the face of it, it looks as though white might be slightly better, as she seems to have raking bishops there, looking at black's queen side. But actually black's position is pretty solid. She only needs one more move, b6, to solidify the whole structure. Rook a d8 comes, and then the bishops are kind of shooting into thin air. Moreover, in a position like this, if black can actually exchange off one of the bishops, and bishop d5 is definitely a move by which black might do that, then white's position could be completely neutralised, all the initiative gone, and white is left with weak pawns on the queen side. That's the big danger to white in a position of this type. All the pieces can come off, and you get a very bad endgame. Which is why Sedina, and she's a female grandmaster, is striving might and main to interrupt this plan of bishop d5 with queen h5. Not so much hitting c5, although that's true of course, but more to stop bishop d5 than anything else. Well, b6, a4, rook a d8. We talked about this strengthening earlier, and that's exactly what black did. White went rook a e1, and now black played a very good move here, knight d7. Both reintroducing ideas of either knight d5 or bishop d5 at some point, but also queen takes a4. Reminding white, that this position actually suddenly is not that easy for her. Despite white's impressive looking piece configuration, black has no weaknesses for white to latch onto. Well, the same can't be said of white's position, whose queenside pawn structure looks rather fragile. h3, queen takes a4, and bishop g5. Sedina has obviously elected to try and solve her problems by activity. But after queen d7, bishop e4, and now h6, black was defending coolly. White goes for it with bishop takes h6. Black parries with f5. Queen g5 threatened mate. Black defended again with rook f7. Bishop f3, and now the sting in the tail from black's perspective, king h7, trapping the bishop. Sedina thought she had everything covered here with queen e3, and to a degree that's true. White gets back the pawn. But problems remain with the queenside pawn structure, and please note now that black has a passed a pawn. Again, white tries to solve her problems by tactics, through tactics. It's possible that Sedina was in time trouble at this point. The moves certainly look as though they have that quality to them. Black parries again. White went rook f2, and now rook d7. Everything's tight at the back. Black is now threatening to take the bishop, so white defended by attacking bishop c6. As stated, black is happy to go into an endgame here. Very happy indeed. White had no option but to take and play d4, and now black brought her king across quite correctly to f6. Problems remain for white in this endgame. The pawn structure is still compromised. As stated, black has a passed a pawn. Bishop f3, protecting the rook. Knight d5, very nice move, offering further exchanges. And problematic for white, because if she takes on e7, then knight takes e7, takes. There are serious problems stopping this pawn. So, going back, rook f2 was played. Knight takes c3. White jettisoned a pawn. Unfortunately though, it's more than that, as rook d7 now was the winning move. And after this move, Sedina either lost on time or resigned. It looks to me as though another pawn is either going down the drain, or white has to let the black king in after rook d2, king e5, and then something like rook e2 check cannot be played because it's attacked by the knight. Rook d3, well, I think in this position we can just take on d5. So that was that. One very dangerous variation of the Vienna, and it's dangerous for both sides, is the line where white plays bishop c4, going back into the bishop's opening. It's certainly true that when white plays bishop c4, the move he is kind of encouraging black to play here is knight takes e4, which if it was only a case of white playing knight takes e4 and black playing d5 with a very good game, would not be attractive at all to the player of the white pieces. But no, it's a fact that when white allows black to play this variation, he's intended to play the super aggressive move queen h5. And what he wants really is for black to go into the aptly named Frankenstein Dracula variation after knight c6, knight b5, g6 queen f3, f5 queen d5, queen f6, whereby black sacrifices a whole rook there on a8, but after b6 we get some incredibly difficult positions arising. Now if white goes in for this, you can bet your bottom dollar that they have studied it very, very closely. And so black would be probably ill-advised to go for this. In fact, most recent games are being won by white. The advent of computer technology has been perfect for the white players who want to play positions like this, and good defences have been worked out. Now, in keeping with our idea of, developing a repertoire which is going to be awkward for the opponent, I believe we entice white into going so far, but then we play the passion-killing move here, bishop e7, which I think is going to lead to a lot of disappointment among white players when they see this move, because the best white's got here is to go queen takes e5 and then black castles. In my view, this is a very reliable way to play this system. Yeah, should be very satisfactory for black. We're going to see a few games with this. Well, the first game I'm going to show you with this line comes from the Ostroda Grandmaster tournament played in 2011 between Krzysztof Jakubowski, grade 2510, and Arkady Leniart, graded 2455. White's position looks very free for the time being, but let's not forget that black has castled here. Now, black has to be quite respectful here of white's idea of knight d5. So Leniart played knight e8, knight ge2 was played, and now black went d6. White retreated his queen to g3, black went knight f6, white went h4, king h8, h5, and now h6. And it's very easy to misassess a position like this. It looks actually as though white is killing black here. But the problem for white is that actually those moves, h4, h5, kind of, they make it difficult for white to find a safe haven for his king. Now, as I say, it does look optically as though white is on top, but objectively, black is not worse in this position. His position is very, very solid, and as we'll see in the game, after f3, knight a5, black was already snaffling one of white's dangerous bishops. So now, having got the bishop pair, black is looking to develop play on the light squares, at the same time frustrate white's coming attack with g4. Then he played bishop e6, and white brought his bishop back to d2, evidently with the idea of knight to f4. Now if we go back, let's say white gets on with the idea of g4, which is, I'm pretty sure, what most club players would play. Then rook e8 is a good move, and if g5, we take it. Now if white takes this pawn on g5, then I think knight d5 forces favourable exchanges. We note that black's pawn structure is the sounder, and he's got this strong light square bishop. Going back, if white tries to crash through with h6, then black goes g6. And now we see the depth to black's idea of king h8. Bishop takes g5, best, knight d5. Bishop takes e7, queen takes e7. Well, it's true that the guy who's defending wants to see those pieces coming off the board. But now, isn't it white who's defending? White has suddenly got a complex of weak dark squares in his camp. If he castles, now it's black that gets onto the attack with a5. And I don't think this position is that easy for white to play. For instance, something like this, queen f5, queen f2, b5, very good, knight takes b5, knight b4. White is in extreme danger here of being hit on the rebound. Note this formation on the king side, very instructive. Black parks his king in the corner, anticipating white's pawn advance, so that when white played g4, g5, black could get to precisely this structure when white finds it almost impossible to break in. That was a very instructive sequence. So going back to the game, Jakubowski played bishop d2, black played knight d5, Off came a pair of minor pieces. White played knight f4, and now black just dropped his bishop back to c6. Throughout this game, black's confidence in the solidity of his position is quite striking. As again, after g4, most club players would probably prefer to be white in this position. That is, until, of course, they saw that it was very difficult to break through. And more than that, black now has really serious chances against the white queen side. For instance, if white castles in this position, well, I'm sure black has many good moves, but I like a5. Just going a4, a3. That's pretty quick, and white has no corresponding attack. So white played knight d3 in the game, shoring up b2. Black played rook e8 check, and now after king d1, the balance of the position is changing. I definitely like black, with the centre opening up, black's bishop pair, and the white attack is stillborn. So Jakubowski, sensing the game was turning, played rook e1. Black again was happy to take. Black's also got the fallback position of having the better endgame, you see. That's the problem with white's game. If it was a simple case of white being slightly worse here with the worse king, he could probably defend it. With the two bishops, with better endgames on the horizon, and with white's king stuck in the middle, black has numerous advantages which add up to quite a significant edge in this position. So white tries to exchange off some pieces. Black is happy to oblige. There are some exchanges, probably suiting both players, and now the queen comes out to f4. Well, black's next move is the first one in the game, which I would query. Black took the queens. That's not bad, but I think stronger was to keep the queens on here with queen h4, king d2, and now bishop b5. I think that black has every chance of a successful attack in this position. You see, white can take some pawns, but that allows the black rook in, and now if rook takes a7, we go bishop takes knight, king takes knight, and now queen f2. And this is horrible for white. Rook's on pre, f-pawn's on pre, king is facing the firing squad. So that would probably have decided this game quite a bit earlier. Queen takes f4, knight takes f4, bishop c6, just leads to a pure ending where black is a little bit better, but not much. Knight e2, g6, both letting the king out and attacking the pawn chain. White doesn't want to allow black a passed pawn, so he leaves the situation as it is regarding the pawns. Black takes and brings up his king. Knight f5 check, king f6, knight takes h6. Of course, the problem with this line for white is that he's allowing black's king to become very active. Black now plays d4, activating the bishop, with the simple threat of bishop takes f3 check. White plays king e2, and now rook h8. So of the past few moves, black has coordinated. White gives a check, yes, king g5, but white is still much worse. Black has played this position actually pretty well. And now it's just a question of whether white can create any counterplay against black's split pawns, which he starts the ball rolling with rook d1. f5 was played, knight f2, rook e8 check, instructively leaving the h5 pawn for the time being. King f1, black is concentrating on the central pawns, and he plays bishop takes f3. So now black has got his passed pawn. Rook takes d4 was answered by d5, and knight h3 check by king takes h5. Knight f4 check was answered by king g5, and after knight takes d5, a forced sequence, black went rook g8. Well, now white has to make his choice. In the game, he just played simply enough. He played c4. He can try a tricky move here, knight f4. Now that's quite an interesting idea. Black still has the edge here if he takes knight e6 checks something like this, and then a5. But is this a win? Let's just see. I would say black is still much better, but white has some serious drawing chances here. So probably best, if we go through this variation once again, after knight f4, is for black to play rook h8. Again, white is worse here, with bishop e4 coming up, the king coming up. Black can bring considerable pressure to bear against white's king in this line. Well, that didn't happen. White played c4. Black went back into a rook and pawn ending. White can't take with the rook there. Totally lost. We just take and play king f6. So c takes d5 is forced. King f6. rook a4, a6, rook b4, b5. And now white's running out of ideas. Black's plan, just king e5, gobble this pawn. White went rook h4 and played king e2, king takes d5, king d3. Not so surprising. King e5 check, king e2, rook g8, rook h6, rook g2 check, king d3, rook takes b2. And in this position, white resigned. Given that rook takes a6, rook takes b3 check is a simple win. So summarising, this will be our first encounter with the aggressive white variation that is trying to entice black to play knight takes e4. We're going to oblige, but after knight d6, bishop b3, we're not going to go on with knight c6. We're just going to play bishop e7 and castle and spoil all white's fun. My next game comes from the Czech Team Championship played in 2010 between Tomáš Kulhanek, grade 2401, and Jan Krejci, grade 2439. We're looking at the line bishop c4, which transposes more or less back into a line of the bishop's opening. Well, it's kind of not quite a bishop's opening, not quite a Vienna, something of a fusion of the two. And now I'm recommending the sharp move, knight takes e4. After which white will start to lick his lips after queen h5, hoping to go for this crazy line where black sacrifices a rook. But we're not going to sacrifice a rook in this position. We're just going to play the quiet move, the spoiler, bishop e7. In this particular game, white didn't take on e5 straight away. He played his knight out to f3. Well, black played knight c6. White played knight takes e5. Black played g6. Knight takes c6. D takes c6. Queen came all the way back to d1. And now black castled. Well, black has a nice steady position here. A slight advantage in development. White can arrest the arrears after castles. But after bishop f6, you know, black has a pretty free game and should be able to count on equality. At any rate, it's not the type of bizarre complications that white is planning on when he goes in for this line. It's a different type of game entirely. White played d3. Black played a5. Just dropping back to the position before d3, just to show you what might happen after d4. Well, black can already strike at white's centre with knight f5. This forces the move d5 as far as I could see, whereupon black can liquidate his pawn weaknesses or maybe even play his knight into d4. So that's why white plays in a more restrained fashion with d3, and black prods at the queen side, trying to force concessions. White goes a4, black brings his pieces confidently to good squares, rook e8 and then bishop e6. Basically this position is absolutely fine for black, with no problems whatsoever. White takes on e6. Well, I suppose with a better pawn structure, white is relatively happy to make an exchange. Of course, this does have the effect of neutralising one of his most powerful pieces, the bishop on b3. But white can scarcely avoid the exchange. Black's just going to go bishop takes b3 if allowed, and that would be terrific for him. White's got to take, and this enables black to mass his pieces in the e-file with queen to e7 and then rook to e8. It's also a very big bonus that the pawn on c6 keeps white's knight out of d5. That's something we don't want to see appearing on the board in a hurry. So white went knight d1, black went b6, white went c3, and now black brought his knight to f5. So steady pressure against white's position. And now white, unhappy with the way the game was going, played g4. Well, this is clearly a risky move. Of course, black's a long way from being able to penetrate with the queen on the light squares in this position against the white king. So white probably thought, well, this is forcing exchanges. Black took on e3, white took with a rook. The more pieces I can get off the board, the better. I can perhaps slowly hope to exploit black's pawn structure here. But queen d7. Okay, well now white played queen to e2 and black played pawn up to c5. If bishop g5 in this position, I presume white is going f4. I don't think there's any way for black to exploit the position on the e-file. So c5 was played, white went b3, and only now did black play bishop g5. Rook e4. Queen comes up to d5, and white plays c4. So we can see white's plan. He's putting all his pawns on white squares, keeping out of the range of black's bishop. But of course, when white plays in this manner, he's creating holes in his position. And black exploits this with queen to d4. Now I think black is really starting to get on top, given that rook e1 is answered by bishop d2, and then the pawn at e4 falls. Perhaps white underestimated black's ability to create play in this position, and after queen f3, rook takes e4, his position was already starting to slide downhill. h3 necessarily protected the pawn. White played bishop to d2. King g2 was answered by king g7, and knight e3 by rook f4. So black is now rather speedily starting to get on top. Knight c2, a tactical idea, hoping to bail out. Black is happy to see this and plays rook to c3. Now in a position like this, the defender has got to try to exchange off as many pawns as possible. So perhaps that white was hoping to do. I mean, he played knight b5, black took on b3. The problem is, black is going to create a pass pawn on the queen side by force, and this, combined with his powerful bishop, will be enough to seal the job. Knight d5, rook takes c4. Here comes some more pawns going off the board, but after rook b4, knight d5, rook takes a4, white finds himself 2 pawns down, without any compensation. Rook b1 was answered by bishop e5. Now black is getting ready to move his rook and march the pawn all the way up. Rook b5 was answered by bishop d4, and now white plays his last chance, basically in an attempt to try and cramp and confine black's king. Rook a1, g5, h6, why not free the king position slightly? Knight c7, black takes on g5, and here we go, a4. So white's got to be very quick in this position with his counterplay. He doesn't have enough. Knight f6 was answered by king e7, and king f3 by a3. Seeing no threats, black just pushes his pawn. Knight d5, king d6, and this was the last move of the game. White's knight is completely dominated by the bishop, and black is just simply threatening to move his rook out of the way, followed by a2 and then queen. I'm not sure what could be simpler than that. So just dropping back to the opening, this line where white plays with knight f3 is not especially dangerous. Black just respond knight c6, and if knight takes e5, then g6 is a very playable continuation. Well, we've taken a look at what might happen in the line where after knight takes e4, white goes queen h5, then knight d6, followed by bishop e7, gives black a solid position and frustrates white to a degree. White is, if he plays this line, getting ready to go into that rucksack variation and defend it out. But this is a fairly solid way to play. Well, now we're going to take a look at other lines in this system whereby actually after knight takes e4, white allows black to execute the fork trick with knight takes e4. Then comes d5. Of course, examples of this variation at a high level are very scarce, as white players basically understand that this gives him nothing. Black gets a nice free game, he gets to regain his piece, and all his pieces can stream out. Yet this was the very continuation of a game between Ahmed Abdul Sattar and Vasily Ivanchuk, played in the Iraq-Ukraine match in the Khanty-Mansisk Olympiad in 2010. So it's very worthwhile seeing how this game developed. Now, just dropping back one move here to the position after knight takes e4, it's worthwhile mentioning bishop takes f7 check, because for beginners and average players this could come as a very scary shock if you don't know what to do about it. White displaces the black king and regains his piece. Fortunately for black, white's development is not that great here, and this allows black to push the knight back with d5. Obviously, if white retreats the knight, then black has a nice centre after c6. If white gives a check against the black king, the king can always just slide back to g8. This is a fine position for black. So going back to d5, more direct here is queen f3 check. And white can set a dirty trap after king g8 and then knight g5, with the idea that if black takes that knight, then out of nowhere, queen takes d5 check is forcing mate in one further move. Again, fortunately for black, after knight g5, black has the more than adequate queen d7. But that's not a move which is accessible at first sight to the beginner because black's blocking in the bishop. However, queen d7 defends against all the threats. Black's getting ready to repel the knight with h6, which extinguishes any white attack, and then black will have better development and a good centre. So just run this variation one more time from knight takes e4, bishop takes f7 check, king takes, knight takes e4, d5, queen f3 check, king g8. Probably white's best move in this position is just to retreat the knight. Black goes knight c6, and again this is a very good position for black, whose plan is simply something like bishop e6 followed by queen f6, just consolidating his centre. The complications have burned out. Black's got the centre and two nice bishops, so that's why they don't do bishop takes f7 check. So knight takes e4, going back to Abdul Sattar versus Ivanchuk. Vasily played the fork trick, and now white played what can only be described as a cheapo move here, d4, a novel gambit which I haven't really seen before, which actually in this game Ivanchuk refutes. But this is precisely the type of move which can come as a very scary shock to the average player, because, you know, white's blasting open the game straight away and black hasn't got a single piece developed yet. Just going back, reviewing the alternatives. Well, if white takes on d5, queen takes d5, d3, you wouldn't believe the number of times I've seen this played in games between novices, chess novices, and they seem very surprised that white has no advantage in this position. But it's worse than that, I think. Black has any advantage there is here. He's got two nice bishops. In particular, that bishop on c8 is a very strong piece. And I think the best that white can do here is to just accept that he's got nothing and to play for equality. Something like this. And white might be equal in this position, but of course black has a very fine game after bishop g4. Again, that's why they don't play this variation. And just reviewing it one more time, if bishop d3, well, we can take this. Clearly, black can play a simple move like bishop d6, but if you're feeling bold, you could even play f5. There's nothing wrong with that move tactically, and then maybe even queen to d5 if you're really keen on sharpening the play. This is again an awkward position for white, with black holding the centre and considerable pressure. And white, of course, cannot play knight f3 in this position due to e4. Well, he can play it, but again, it's not very good for him. So, going back to Sattar versus Ivanchuk, white played this move d4. Black took the bishop. That's one nice advantage of this line. Black gets the two bishops. White went queen e2. Black went queen takes d4. And now knight f3. So, Abdul Sattar has obviously taken the view in this game that if play develops normally, he hasn't got a hope in hell against Ivanchuk. He's just going to get outplayed. So what he's going to do is to try and create an irrational position, something crazy, where even the strongest player can go wrong. Good tactics, the best tactics, because what are Abdul Sattar's chances of beating Ivanchuk in a normal game? He's 23-42, a strong player, but Ivanchuk's 27-50. Very small indeed. However, in this game, Ivanchuk just proves himself easily the equal of the tactics here, and he dropped his queen back to d5. Whereupon white played knight to c3, which is a double attack on the queen and the pawn at e5. Now, just dropping back, there are some crazy lines here if white castles. I mean, I think if he wanted to carry on bamboozling Ivanchuk, then this is the move he could have played. And the computers are showing me that the bold f6 is best for black, just protecting the pawn. If white goes rook d1, hitting the queen, then we can drop back to f7. And white can go ultra violent here by taking on f6, believe it or not, taking on e5. This is a crazy line, but this is the sort of thing that white must do in this position, open things up before black gets developed. Nevertheless, bishop e6, queen takes rook, queen g7, takes, and by sticking to the basics of returning material to get a good position, black is just better here. He's got two lovely bishops raking white's queen side, and black is just getting ready to complete development with knight c6 and rook d8. So this will give black the better game, but maybe, in view of what happens in the game, this is what Abdul Sattar should have done. I mean, maybe he didn't even see that variation, you know, sacking both knights is not obvious. It just occurred to me because I was analysing with deep Ribka. So, as I say, in the game, white played knight c3, black played bishop b4, very much in the style of the open game, not giving any ground, just developing and gaining time. White castled. Well, of course, white can regain his pawn here with queen takes e5, takes. He's absolutely not better here after bishop e6. I much prefer black's position with the two bishops and an extra pawn. So white has to throw caution to the winds. Castled. Ivanchuk took on c3 and played knight c6. The thing about super grandmasters is if they don't see any threats, they just carry on with their plan. They don't get frightened about ghosts, you know. A lot of black players would just say, oh, white's got a tremendous attack. I can't really give up the bishop in this position on c3. Ivanchuk is totally rational here. He knows that white's going to play bishop e3 and stop him from castling on the king side. But he doesn't see anything here for white. He plays f6 and he's getting ready to cast on the queen side with the help of moves such as bishop d7 followed by castles. So that's why, for instance, in this position, Sattar doesn't play a move like rook fd1. Queen a5 hits the bishop. Bishop must move. Next move is bishop d7 and then castles. So I think what I'm saying is white's got to find something fairly extraordinary here to keep the initiative going, or he's just going to be 2 pawns down for nothing. So that's why Sattar comes out with knight d4. Well, black played bishop d7 as advertised. Rook fd1. And seeing no real threats, Ivanchuk castled. Another cold-blooded move which says to white, you can't do anything with your knight on d4. You can give a discovered attack, but when you move your knight, I'll simply move my queen. And that's what happened in the game. Incidentally, if white goes knight f5 in this position, then queen a5. And, you know, white can get some sort of opposite colour bishop position after knight e7 check, something like this. But unfortunately, he's still 2 pawns down. 1 pawn you might be able to get away with it in opposite colour bishop positions. 2 pawns, not really. So white goes knight b3, keeping the pieces on, avoiding exchanges. Queen f7, and then he brings the knight into c5. Again, a lesser player might have been intimidated, but Ivanchuk is not going to be intimidated. And with b6, he's offering white the chance to take everything off on d7, which is exactly what happened. White's allowed to take on c4, and now rook d8. So perfect play really here against a gambit. Giving a pawn back, white's still a pawn down. He's got double pawns. Black's fully coordinated. Black now has a winning position. Moreover, he threatens queen d1 check, winning straight away. So that's why white goes h3. King b7, keeping the king nice and safe. Rook b1, paying lip service to an attack which isn't there. Queen d5, queen a4. Queen takes a2, seeing no ghosts. Queen d5, basically white's losing this position. He's got absolutely nothing. Queen d2, threatening to go queen f4 check, exchanging the queens. Bishop c5, the last cheapo in the house. And, well, Ivanchuk could go queen f4 check. Instead, he decides to snaffle yet another pawn, which completely finishes white off, as numerous pieces now are under attack. So a very good demonstration there by a very strong grandmaster of how to handle the open game. Basically, the variation here, after knight takes e4, where white recaptures, he's not really very good for him. It leads to equality at best, as does the cheapo move, bishop takes f7. Occasionally, on a dark chess night, you are going to come up against opponents who play crazy gambits against you. And one such gambit is the Boden-Kieserinsky gambit, where after knight takes e4, our preferred move, white goes knight f3, just gambiting a pawn, allowing black to take on c3, whereupon white is going to recapture with the d pawn. Now this opening has got to be respected. The chances of you facing it are very, very rare indeed, but when it happens, you have to be ready. It's clear that for the pawn, white has opened up all the lines, and he's threatening ideas such as queen d5, knight takes e5, all sorts of things like that. However, against this line, black can play a very cold-blooded move, which I think is good, and I'm going to recommend the main line here, f6. This is the move really which has driven the Boden-Kieserinsky out of business at the highest level. But of course it requires a certain type of courage to play this move. Now just to illustrate how this idea might work, I'm going to show you a game from the Hungarian Team Championship played in 1991 between Gabor Berenyi and Tamás Halas. Searching the database is actually looking for examples of this gambit. You know, it may have been popular in the 19th century, but among grandmasters these days, such an opening with white is almost impossible to find. It's simply too risky white is giving black an extra central pawn. It's not just a pawn, it's a central pawn, which can be bolstered. And when you've got a pawn in the middle, it really does stop the opponent from finding good squares for his pieces. Black's plan is probably something simply like c6 and d5, if he can ever get those moves in. So white's job over the next couple of moves, that's all white's got in this position, 2 extra moves or something like that, is to try and disrupt the natural plan that black has. So knight h4 is basically the mainline move, and with this move obviously white is introducing the threat of queen h5 check, which is quite devastating if allowed. So black is supposed to go g6, and now white in turn comes out with f4. This is the type of thing that they have to do when they play the Bodenkies-Zariski. You are trying to open up the game immediately. Now, it must be said that if black doesn't know his stuff in this system, then it would be unwise to go in for this position, because there are a lot of tricks and traps. I mean, you can see there that black's king side is not ideal, but at the time, for the time being, he's keeping white out. It's worthwhile noting here that moves like queen d5 are simply answered by queen e7. I mean, that's the move black plays in the game anyway, and if white castles leading up to f4, then c6 is very effective. So white can't delay this move, f4, that's the thing. White gets attacked immediately with c6 and d5, driving him back, and he has to avoid that continuation. Once again, after castles, c6 is a good move, and if white tries queen e2 pinning, then black can just play very naturally here with d5 and knight to d7, bolstering the centre. White has some compensation for the pawn here, but obviously not enough. So, going back to our game, Berenyi played f4, and now black played another very good move, queen to e7. And it's a good move for 2 reasons. Number 1, it protects the pawn on e5, and number 2, it sets a very small trap, in that after castles, queen c5 check, black nabs the errant bishop on c4. So, white went on with f5 in the game, and that's supposed to be a good move. Black played queen to g7. Well, already, if you're feeling in gambit mode, you can try a funny move of your own here, c6, giving up the pawn on g6 in order to go d5. Clearly, this is a much more risky procedure than we're going to see in the game, but it might attract some gambiteers out there. After queen h5, king d8, bishop e2, queen g7, black is certainly drumming up some interesting compensation. Well, actually, it's not compensation, material equality has been re-established. But if I can do without my king in the middle, then I will certainly try to do that. And that I prefer the game move, actually, queen to g7. And now, really, in this position, the onus is on white to actually demonstrate something, with black's plan of c6 and then d5 getting ready to take shape. In the game, Berenyi couldn't find anything better than bishop e3. Black went c6. White went g4. And now black went d5, bishop b3, g5. And this is how quickly the game can turn in this variation. Because after knight f3, h5, not only did white not have any compensation for the pawn, he's actually much worse now, a pawn down, because black is getting the initiative. Note the peril of giving away central pawns in the opening. The opponent can dominate the centre like this, and really, white can't get in. So after g takes h5, bishop takes f5, rook g1, knight d7, black was well on top, with castles on the queen side imminent. White played queen e2, black played bishop e7, white castled on the queen side, and now with a small idea of h4 in the position, black played queen h7. So black is playing this very well, just keeping white out, and now the idea is simply queen takes h5. So white played a kind of decoy move here, h6, and the point of that is after queen takes h6, he's going to go h4. Black instead, in the game, castles on the queen side. He figures he can just round up that pawn on h6 at any time he likes. White went h4 anyway. g4, knight h2, and now bishop f8. King b1 was played, and black went bishop takes h6. Bishop takes a7 was answered by bishop f4, and now white was getting a bit desperate. Well, he can see his king side falling apart. I mean, if he goes knight takes g4 in this position, queen takes h4, White is really in trouble here. I mean, look at his bishops. This bishop on a7 looks dangerous, but what does he actually do? The bishop on b3 is completely blocked out. The knight on g4 is also in trouble. So white in the game goes in for a kind of desperate sacrifice here. This runs into bishop takes c2 check, another excellent move. Obviously, if queen takes bishop, we go queen takes queen and then bishop takes h2. White went king a1. Halas snapped off the rook, snapped off the bishop. Knight b8, careful defence. Rook c5 check, knight c6. Knight takes g4. Well, no sacrifices work, I'm afraid. If we go takes queen a6 check, simply queen b7, and that's the end of the game. So knight takes g4, queen d3, excellent centralisation to finish, and white resigned because he's loads of material behind. So just to summarise, going back to our opening, the Boden-Kieseritzky gambit must be given respect, but there's nothing wrong with f6, and there's nothing wrong with the cold-blooded move g6 either. Queen e7, c6 and then d5 is the upcoming plan. My next game, which very much displays the viability of Black's system, comes from the Saratov Governor's Cup played in October 2011 between Alexei Shirov playing with White and Michael Royce playing with Black. Now, although White is more of a household name than Royce is a 2668 Grandmaster and therefore cannot be underestimated. And he's quite happy to go d5 in this position. Shirov drops away with bishop b3, that's the recommended formula. And now the first really interesting moment in the game as Black flicks in a check, bishop b4 check. The point of this is to force White to play really a move he doesn't want to play. If he puts the bishop in the way, I think Black's happy to take, and then perhaps castle. If he puts the knight in the way on d2, then White's development is gummed up to an extent, and I think Black can even get away with taking on e4 in this position. So Shirov plays the natural move c3, and now Black brings his bishop back to d6, content that he's taken away the c3 square from the white knight. And the net effect of that is that the d5 pawn feels a little bit more comfortable. This is a typical move order nuance which grandmasters sometimes use. Well, Shirov continues playing as aggressively as possible with bishop g5, and Black solidifies his centre with bishop e6. And now, true to form, Shirov tries to blast open the position with d4. But whereas at club level, this type of move could come as a shock to the opponent, Royce is ready for it, and he plays d takes e4. Knight fd2. E takes d4, liquidating the centre, and now knight takes e4. And Black answered this very safely with bishop e7, a move which more or less promotes exchanges. Well, Shirov took on f6, took on e6, and now played the whole point of his combination here, queen to b3. I'm pretty sure when Shirov played d4 about 5 moves ago, he'd seen through to this possibility. The white queen attacks both e6 and b7. But Black can defend himself, and this is what Royce continued to do accurately with queen e7. Shirov took on f6 check and took on d4. And now Black settled for knight a6. That's the only real development of the knight possible here without allowing White to take on b7. White played knight c3, Black castled, White castled, and now rook d6. A nice move, just making way for the h-rook to come into the game at d8. Black's targeting the weak d4 pawn. Knight e4 was answered by rook d5, and knight c3 by rook d6, knight e4, rook d5, and just when it looked as though Shirov was going to acquiesce to a draw, he played on with queen to e3. Whereupon Black just went on with his plan. Knight c3, rook d7, and now it's up to Shirov to show what his plan is. Rook he1 attacked e6, but Black is easily able to defend that with knight c7. This position is roughly balanced. I mean, I know that Black's pawns here on e6 and f6 are rather weak, but so is the white pawn on d4. White tried to liquidate that pawn with d5. Well, there were some captures. Black took on d5. White took, Black took again, White captured, Black took again. Now White's got a choice. Does he take on a7 here, or does he take on e6? Well, if he takes on a7, there's no real threat. I mean, I imagine black can easily defend this with queen c5 check. Queen takes, rook takes. This is a perfectly satisfactory rook endgame for black. Shirov tries to get a better version of this in the game by taking on e6, but again, it's all burning out after rook f5. The point of that move is to gain a tempo for king d7. So if white plays f3, black just goes king d7. That's why Shirov goes into action with rook e8 check and rook h8, but after rook takes f2, it's all burning out. More pawns left the board. After rook takes b7, rook takes g2, rook takes a7, rook takes h2, a4, and then king e5. I'm not sure that white has even a nominal advantage in this position. Indeed, I slightly prefer black, but of course the position is drawn, and that's how the game ended. Roy is offered a draw. Shirov accepted. So my conclusion on c6 is that it's a pretty solid and easy to play way against the bishop's opening. The bishop's opening is very commonly played at all levels of chess, and therefore we have to have a good defence against it. Against 2 bishop c4, I'm going to recommend knight f6, and if white insists on the bishop's opening proper with d3, then I'm going to recommend the solid system with c6. The initial motivation for this is very easy to understand. Black wants to force through d5 and gain time. Sometimes you have to be a little bit careful with the move d5, as the e-pawn might become a bit tender after that if it's played slightly too early. But in general, this is a very reliable system which has been played by some of the best players in the world. It gets my 100% recommendation. To show you a recent game with it, I'm going to go to the Nachivan Open played in May 2012 between Sergei Tiviakov, playing white, 2673 Grandmaster, and Viorel Yordachescu, grade 2644. And this game will clearly demonstrate the solid nature of black's system. Well, white played knight f3, and black pushed forward in the centre immediately with d5. Obviously white can take this pawn and then give a check, but even there, bishop d7, takes, knight takes is no particular problem for black. Castles, bishop d6, black has the centre. So the normal move here is just to drop back with bishop b3, and that's what Tiviakov did. And now Yordachescu played an interesting move, a5. I haven't seen this move played too often in this particular position, but it contains an immediate threat, and part of the positional motivation behind it is that later on black wants to secure the c5 square. So you might be thinking of a manoeuvre, something along the lines of knight a6 to c5 or knight bd7 to c5, whichever is more appropriate. Well, white played a3 to protect against the threat of a4, and now black protected his e-pawn with bishop d6. Now came knight c3. Well, Tiviakov wants to force a decision in the centre of the board. I don't think bishop e6 here is a very good move by black, as then knight g5 hits the bishop. But black can solve all his problems by pushing forward with d4, gaining some space, and that's what Yordachescu did. Now I suppose Tiviakov is relatively happy once black has played d4. The diagonal of the bishop on b3 has opened up, and white's getting ready to manoeuvre his knight Ruy Lopez style into the position via knight g3. But black is happy too, as he gets to play his favoured move, knight a6. White goes c3, black takes, and now the knight comes into c5. Well, of course, white doesn't want the bishop to be taken, so he drops it back to c2, and black castled. White castled, rook e8. So what we've got here is a kind of Ruy Lopez position, where black is much freer than he would normally be in that opening. White's loosened his centre a little bit, black's got plenty of open play in the centre, and no special problems with the development of any of his pieces. White played bishop e3, and black now played b6, whereupon white took on c5. Well, that is a big concession, but white's got a concrete idea in mind. If he continued to maintain the tension with knight g3, then I think black can make sense of the open d file here with rook a7. That's a nice move, intending to swing the rook to d7 at the earliest possible moment. Possibly black should play g6 now in order to stop knight f5. I think rook d7 first might allow knight f5, but g6 first, then rook d7 gives black a good game. And if white plays something like rook fd1, we go bishop a6. This is a nice equal position for black. No problems with any of the pieces, and well, there are certain ideas for black based upon the d3 pawn. So Tiviakov, back to the game, removes the bishop. The idea is the knight. He's going to go knight takes e5 in this position, and then d4. But even here, you know, this is no particular problem for black. Although white gets the better pawn structure, black has plenty of active play. And in the open game, pointed development is very important. So black played bishop a6. White started the slow process of unravelling his position with f3. Black took back on c5. White went rook f2, getting out of the pin. And now there came an active manoeuvre by black. Knight d7. And then knight b6. So black is eyeing up weak squares in white's camp. This is basically an equal position. Queen e1 was followed by the excellent move, bishop d3. And one of the points of that is that if black pins the bishop, white pushes forward. This is an okay position for black. So Tiviakov just accepted that he had nothing in this position, took on d3, and went knight g3. And then after rook fd8, it was all burning out. Black takes the d file, stopping both rook d2 and rook d1. e5 was answered by knight c4, and rook f3 by queen c2. Rook f2, queen d3, rook f3, queen c2, and the two players agreed a draw in this situation. So that's a pretty representative game of what this variation looks like at a high level. Basically, the line with c6 is rock solid. Let's move on now to other variations of the bishop's opening, and we're going to deal now with the central break d4. Well, this is a move favoured by aggressive players. White tries to open up the centre immediately and cause some problems for black. Black should certainly take the pawn on d4, and now the most common move is knight f3. It's worthwhile noting here that if white plays e5, then black can play the traditional break d5 and thereby secure a good game. Now the point is, after knight f3, obviously black has quite a few moves here. He can play knight takes e4 in this position, which will take us into the dangerous waters of the Arutsov gambit, where white, in return for a pawn, gets very fast development. I don't recommend that black goes in for this line. Just going back to knight f3, obviously black can just go knight c6 and go into a fairly well documented variation of the Italian game, but there's no need in the open game to be so submissive, and I'm going to recommend a combative move here, bishop b4 check, which isn't played very often, which actually looks pretty good for black. And we're going to take a look now at the game Martin Burrows versus Grandmaster Ivan Sokolov, played in the Reykjavik Open 2011. I've found a few games where this move bishop b4 check has been played, and in each case black has got a good position. The essential problem for white is he doesn't really want the pieces swapped off in this position, so bishop d2 just makes black's life very easy. Black would probably trade the bishops off and castle with a nice easy game. He's also got queen e7 in this position. There are numerous options. If white wants to be consistent with this line, he's got to go through with the move c3. Black takes the pawn. White recaptures with the pawn. In the next game we'll see what happens if he recaptures with the knight. And now Sokolov plays the key move here, d5. Typical move in the open game. Black just frees up his entire game by playing this break. White took on d5, bishop d6, and now both sides castled. So black has not been greedy. He's given back his pawn, but in return he's got nice free play for his pieces. And white's pawn structure is nothing to write home about. So black already, I would say, has a nice position. Now it's clear that Burrows really was not expecting Sokolov to play this line, and he played a rather passive move here, bishop b3. In the game Kotiani versus Zhigalko, whose grade's 2555, Bad Visay 2011, white played a more aggressive move here, bishop g5. But after that, black wasn't in too much difficulty. He played h6, white maintained the pin, and now the fluid developing move, bishop f5. That's what I like about this variation. It's pretty easy for black to get all these pieces out in a very fluid manner. White played knight d4, black retreated his bishop to h7 in this game, white went queen b3, and now whilst black could play b6 here, he decided on a more aggressive approach, c5. White retreated his knight, and now black went b6, white went knight bd2, black went a6, a4, and now knight bd7, with a fine position for black, who went on to win in 41 moves. I should mention, just dropping back to the move Queen b3, that black can also play much more safely here with b6, which is okay for him as well. In the game Burrows versus Sokolov, bishop b3 was played, and Sokolov played knight bd7. Probably white wants to get this pawn rolling, get it up to c4, but black's got a very nice square on c5 for the knight. And indeed, after bishop g5, that's exactly where Sokolov put the knight. Queen to d4, building up pressure. Knight c e4, with a fine position for black, who is now attacking the bishop. And Burrows took on f6. Well, clearly you can play a move like bishop h4 in this position. I suppose after that, black can consider moves like bishop f5. He's got rook e8. He can even unpin with queen to d7. All these options are on the table. There's bishop c5 in the position as well. All things considered, Burrows took on f6. Black recaptured with the knight, and now white plays c4. Bishop b4, c5, and now bishop a5 was Sokolov's provocative choice. And white put his knight on a3. I think Sokolov was playing flat out for the win in this game. I mean, he was 400 or 500 higher rated than his opponent. In playing in this manner, he shows himself willing to take risks. I mean, just going back to the position after, for instance, bishop c4, let's just say, if black had wanted to, he could have just put a stopper on the advance of the c-pawn by playing knight d7. That looks like a very reasonable move to me. And then just play the knight up to c5. This looks okay for black. Instead, Sokolov has played provocatively. b6 was answered by knight c4. Black took on c5 and then retreated his bishop to b6. And it's clear that Martin Burrows is just after a draw here because he swapped off the pieces. Queen d4 was answered by bishop b7 and rook fd1 by queen d6. When you play against somebody much stronger than you, it's really a good idea just to meekly swap all the pieces off, because all you end up with here is a positional liability, in this case the pawn on d5, with nothing else to show for it. Basically, black's got a very comfortable game, no problems, and can take this pawn at his leisure. After rook a d1, Sokolov had prepared, bishop takes b3. White took on d6, black recaptured with the rook, and now we see the problem, that if white plays rook takes d6 here, black goes bishop takes d1, rook takes d1, and is simply a pawn up in a very simple endgame position. So Burrows took on b3, Sokolov played knight e4, white took the rooks off, of course white's still a pawn down in this position, f6 to get rid of the knight b5 to protect the pawn, and now the next task is really to improve the position of his pieces and create a passed pawn, and this is what Sokolov tries to do. He brings his rook up to d5, king up to e6, h5 to break up the pawns on the king side, which gives the black king a nice square on f5, king e3, rook d7, rook a4, c5, rook a6, knight c7, and seeing nothing better in this position, with knight d5 check coming up, white decided to resign. Summarising, I think bishop b4 check after knight f3 gives black a nice position. In the next game, we're going to be looking at what happens when white recaptures with the knight, going back into the realm of the Scotch Gambit. Well, if that last game from Sokolov didn't convince you, let's see a game now from the Bayern Hoffmann Bank International, played in November 2011, between Jens Kotiani, whose grade's 2406, presumably he's an IM, and Grandmaster Andrei Gigalko, grade 2555. You'll recall we're taking this pawn on d4, and after knight f3, inviting transposition back into an Italian game, we're going bishop b4 check. This is the move which throws the spanner in the works from white's perspective. Kotiani took on d5 with the pawn, and now Gigalko played this typical freeing break of so standard in the open game, d5, and after e takes d5, he moved his bishop back to d6. Black contents himself with returning the pawn and getting free development for his pieces. Both sides castle, and now white puts black in this pin with bishop g5, in distinction to the Burrows-Sokolov game where bishop b3 was played. And black decided to just hit this bishop Bishop came back to h4, and now black played his bishop out to f5. Knight came to d4, bishop came back to h7. And now white brought his queen out to d3. Pawn up to c5. Again, black shows that he's not especially worried about the pawn at b7 in this particular moment, as queen takes b7 can perhaps be answered by c takes d4, queen takes a8, and now the interesting move here, queen c7, which fulfills a lot of functions. It traps the white queen in on a8, it hits the bishop on c4, and it hits the pawn on h2. I don't think Kotiani liked this continuation, because he retreated his knight to f3, and now black just played b6, knight bd2, a6. White restrained black on the queen side, black completed his development. So what I like about this line, stated clearly, is that black has no real problems with development. It's white, moreover, who has to worry about his queenside pawn structure long term. White played rook fe1, and now black got aggressive with g5. And after bishop g3, Zhigalko took on g3 and played knight to e8. Evidently, he wants to blockade the pawn on d5 by putting his knight on d6. White played knight e5, black took, and played his knight to d6, so mission accomplished. Unless some of you are worried about the apparent weakness of the black king side here, let's remind ourselves that all the white pieces are on the queen side in this position, a long way from the attack. Moreover, it should be relatively easy for black to defend against this attack by a judicious queen f6 at the right moment, or maybe just exchanging off a pair of rooks on e5 with rook fe8, something like that. So white doubled up, and now black played another interesting move here, queen to b8, saying, well, you can't really attack me on the king side, I've got plenty of defence there, I'm going through with counterplay after b5, and that's exactly what happened. Now came rook a3. Queen c1, white is struggling to find targets. He's hitting the rook now, and he might be threatening a sacrifice on g5 at the right moment. First black has to protect his rook, white blocked, and now the queen came back to d8, with the queen side secured. It's my impression that the international master here could not see what to do, so he's rather aimlessly manoeuvring around, not making his position worse, hopefully, whilst black is building up. As stated, black's manoeuvred his queen to f6, a very good square, and now he plays rook fa8 with the idea of exchanging off rooks after rook a1, which, when you've got the better pawn structure, exchanges are a good idea. White doesn't want exchanges. Black insists with a splendid move, bishop d3. That really is a good move in this situation. Rook takes f6 was answered by bishop takes e2. Now we see white's problem. His bishop on d1 is suddenly pinned. So white's got to take on e2 with the rook. Rook takes d1 check. King f2. And now another splendid move here. Rook a6. Setting up clear ideas of rook takes d2. And then knight e4 check. So white played rook f3. Obviously black could now play rook takes d2 check. He decides to expand on the king side with f5, gaining more space. And black played g4. Rather desperate continuation here, trying to gain some coordination. The grandmaster is on the ball. He plays knight f5. White gives a check. King f7, the knight on f5 defends everything. White tries to move in with his knight. Black plays his knight to d4. Well, now this position is very problematic because white's got both his rooks on pre. He was probably intending that knight takes c5 would save the day, but after rook f6 check, king g3, knight takes e2 check, it becomes clear that, well, actually, white has blundered. My guess is he was probably in time trouble at this point. Rook takes e2, rook f4, concluded a well-played game, as white is now in a state of almost paralysis. The rook on d1 ties him down. Probably black's plan is simply to advance the b-pawn. It's worthwhile noting if white moves the knight, then rook d3 is going to lead to checkmate in a very short order. So another good game, and it seems that this approach with e takes d4 and then bishop b4 check is very viable indeed.